Okay, so we just had a really eye-opening talk about security, and I'm one of those terrible users that probably need code to protect me and the system protect me because I feel I'm annoyed by permissions and files and things like that, but then I do bad things. So fantastic. So now in terms of learning more about how this ecosystem works and how the various components of the server actually get spawned and maybe some warnings about security, we're going to have a talk now on everyone's favorite topic, documentation. But actually that's a really important topic, and there are some frameworks that are being developed on different ways of what do we put out there so that people can find the information that they need in the right order. And so I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Sarah Gibson, who will go ahead and then introduce the actual speaker for today's talk, who's going to talk about JupyterHub documentation in the Diátaxis framework, as soon as we've got the technology working. Keep on talking.
I thought I was trying.
Well, you know what? I'll give a plug then in terms of what we're going to talk about. So this particular speaker, unfortunately, isn't here physically. Visa issues prevented Allan from showing up. But the program in which he's doing, Allan is an outreachy intern. So the outreachy program is a way of having people sort of come and get embedded into a community. And so JupyterHub was lucky enough to have 3 outreachy interns go through a program, and Sarah was one of the mentors of this program. And this is one of the frameworks by which we can get new people into the Jupyter ecosystem. So whether or not it be JupyterHub or any other component of the Jupyter ecosystem, and you're like, how do we get new people? Well, one of the ways of getting those new people into it, and then hopefully to stick around in it, is through programs like Outreachy, which will help you connect with individuals who have great skills, but maybe they're just not like next door to you physically, but they're some other part of the world. So this is sort of the output of a very recent mentorship program. Again, from the JupyterHub team, trying to improve our overall documentation and Diátaxis framework.
Okay.
And
Thank you, James, for
Sarah. Okay.
We're doing that, and let me just bring up this video. As James mentioned, Allan unfortunately couldn't be with us here today, so I'm just going to present his video presentation, and then I will do my best to answer any questions at the end.
Hi everyone, and hello from Nairobi, Kenya. Welcome to this session in which I'll be talking about my experience and lessons while working to restructure and improve JupyterHub's documentation using a framework called Diátaxis. I am Allan Wasega, and my sincere apologies for not being with you in person today. Kindly allow me to put up my presentation. Great. Here's a link to the slides as well if you'd like to download them. And I do hope you get to enjoy this session and take away at least one key lesson from it. Today I will cover 6 main things. 1 is a very brief introduction to who I am. 2 will be what is the need for documentation in open source software projects. And we are all here because we work with or around open source software. And so would our work be easier if documentation did not exist? I hardly believe so. And 3 will be what is the Diátaxis framework. And I will cover very briefly what the framework is about and its place in documentation projects. 4 will be my experience using this framework to restructure and improve JupyterHub's documentation. 5 would be what are some of the lessons I learned from and during this exercise. And we'll finally close with a Q&A guided by Dr. Sarah Gibson, with whom I worked closely at JupyterHub. And as I mentioned before, my name is Allan Wasega. I'm a technical writer based in Nairobi, Kenya. I'm also a mentor and program manager at Kamilimu, which is a Nairobi-based program that offers structured mentorship to university students pursuing technology-aligned courses. At Kamilimu, we complement classroom learning rather than replace it. And in doing so, we enhance the employability of the students with whom we work. And between December 2022 and March this year, I was an outreach intern working with JupyterHub to restructure its documentation. And this exercise introduced me to a host of new things, such as what is open source software and some of the challenges faced by such projects. For example, I remember having very long discussions with Dr. Sarah around software licensing, which is not a topic I had given much thought to before. And what is the importance of documentation in such projects? I also learned about the tools and processes used to create such documentation. And it is here that I got to learn about things such as Sphinx and read the docs and using GitHub to host documentation projects. This entire experience birthed this talk. And today I want to remind you of the sometimes challenging journey of a beginner technical writer who seeks to contribute to open source software documentation. And I'll first begin with a very simple question. What is the need for documentation in open source software projects? And I believe that the ability of users, and by a user, I mean somebody ranging from the end customer of a particular software to its software developers. So the ability of these users to adopt a given piece of software, and in this case, even including open source software, depends on the quality, navigability, and accessibility of that software's documentation. And by quality, I mean, for instance, are the docs well written? By navigability is how easy or how hard is it to find what I'm looking for, and especially when I need it. And by accessibility is, are the docs readable and uniformly formatted? I believe that these three qualities further determine whether that software project, and now in this case, particularly open source software projects, will get any meaningful contributions. And what do I mean by this? Open source software projects are not like the other proprietary software projects in which you're likely to find a centralized team that is easy to reach and consult in case of a challenge. But on our end, teams are mostly distributed and communication is asynchronous as people work largely according to their own schedules. So what happens if, as a new contributor, I cannot find a document to guide me? So I believe two things could happen. One, I will either do things wrong, or two, I'll give up on the project altogether. And while documentation that meets these criteria is desirable, reality is often anything but. And why? It is sometimes not easy to find information within engineering documentation. Again, remember the question of navigability. And two is some docs are outdated or irrelevant, which brings up the point of documentation quality. And three, which is something I faced, is steep learning curves for beginner writers who then struggle to make their contributions. And I'd like to hypothesize here a bit because of point three, points one and two sometimes occur since maintainers are likely to be busy to update or reorganize documentation. So we end up in kind of like a cyclic loop. And late last year, JupyterHub's maintainers participated in outreach to bring on board an intern who could restructure and improve JupyterHub's documentation using the Diátaxis framework. And outreach is a program that offers paid internships to people all over the world in a bid to support diversity in tech. And it is through them that I got to work on this project using the same framework. And this now begs the question, what is the Diátaxis framework? And put simply, Diátaxis is a framework or set of guidelines for organizing technical documentation. And it identifies 4 modes of documentation: tutorials, how-to guides, technical references, and explanation, divided across 4 axes, depending on whether the documentation is learning-oriented, task-oriented, understanding-oriented, or information-oriented. And according to this framework, documentation is not one large thing, but 4. And understanding the implications of these and how those 4 different things work can help improve most documentation. And so tutorials are, by definition, just are lessons that take the reader by the hand through a series of steps to complete a project of some kind. And now tutorials are mostly learning oriented. And how-to guides are directions that take the reader through the steps required to solve a real-world problem, and they are goal-oriented. Reference guides, on the other hand, are technical descriptions of the machinery or software and how to operate it or run it. And reference material is information oriented. And explanation, lastly, are discussions that clarify and illuminate a particular topic. Explanations last are now understanding oriented. And in the end, Diátaxis promises to make documentation and projects better, and the teams that work with them more successful. Now, on to the cool stuff. What was my experience using this framework to restructure and improve JupyterHub's documentation? Long story short is it was scary in the beginning, but quite rewarding at the end. And because I was new to technical writing, especially at such a grand scale, I was like a deer caught in the headlights. This was really right in the beginning, and I did not know where to even begin. And in the following slides, I'll show you the approach I took to undertake and complete the task at hand. My step 0 of N was to really understand the task. And at this point, JupyterHub was something completely new to me, a new technology, because so far what I had interacted with was Jupyter Notebooks, but not JupyterHub. So there was JupyterHub on the one hand. On the other hand is the framework that we are supposed to be using to now restructure the documentation, which is Diátaxis. And bringing these 2 separate things together took me a bit of a while, and I spent a lot of days going through the documentation and reading. Now this is JupyterHub's documentation, and reading the docs to get a feel of how they fit into the 4 quadrants of the framework. And once this was done, it was time for me to move to step 1. And step 1 was just a rough mapping of docs according to the Diátaxis framework. And I simply opened a spreadsheet, a shareable spreadsheet, and did a rough mapping of those docs into the 4 quadrants, and also included my thinking behind the mapping direction I took, and shared this sheet with the project maintainers. And so, for instance, in this case, under what was broadly categorized as getting started, we had configuration basics, networking basics. Those are particular files that were involved in the configuration or the networking technology of JupyterHub. And when I read them, to me, they felt like how-to guides. And my reason for that, I also gave my reason for that. And when moving on to now step 2, when after sharing the docs with the maintainers, and you can see in this case what I had before as the configuration basics and networking basics as how-to guides, the maintainers advised that this felt more of as tutorial. And so based on that feedback, I moved them. And even here, one of the maintainers, that's Min, said, so one file is an example of a tutorial because the goal is understanding the API, not specifically how to achieve a specific action. So this kind of feedback really helped me to refine my thinking and understand better the project itself, JupyterHub, and even the Diátaxis itself as well. So this kind of feedback helps me to get the mapping right. And yeah, so I'll come back to it later, why this kind of collaboration is key. At step number 3, I then went ahead to open pull requests to actually move the docs in JupyterHub's GitHub repository. And the advantage of this exercise now for me as a beginner technical writer is that my contributions are public and I can always refer to them and see my growth as a technical writer over time. And in the end, one thing that I have come to learn is that the process of writing documentation never ends. So at the end of my internship, I created a GitHub issue to document pending tasks that can be completed later. And this issue is still open, it's not yet closed. And if you'd like to contribute to JupyterHub's docs, this task would be a great starting point for you. And as Confucius said, learning without thought is labor lost. And it's time to reflect upon some of the lessons that I learned from this entire exercise. The first of which is that beginner technical writers need a healthy dose of audacity, but this should not be conflated with recklessness. One thing that I learned is one needs the courage to simply start writing, because at the end of the day, you are a writer and your output is what you can write. But at the same time, whatever you are producing should be meaningful and contribute to the larger goal. And for me, I was like a deer in the headlights before, frozen and unsure where to start from. Then I just found the courage to clone the JupyterHub repo, get my development install running, and then I started working my way around the project. So my advice to anybody else would be find the courage to start, but the wisdom to proceed with caution, as one small breakage could have significant ramifications elsewhere. And I'm a huge listener of podcasts. And in one of them, Seth Godin talks about failing on our way to mastery. In other words, perfection at the get-go hardly exists. Instead, Seth advises people to start an undertaking. Simply start, even though they're likely to fail at the beginning, but continually improve as they work towards a better outcome. And I believe that this to be the case even in the technical writing space. In my case, what happened is I had to get my rough copies out, get the input of my mentors and project maintainers, and incorporate their feedback to have a document worth merging to the main branch. And without being open to this process of being wrong, this process of continually improving on what I've worked on, I would not have made any progress. And tied to the previous point is the fact that documentation is a team effort. And I learned that no one person, and Dr. Sarah kept on telling me this, is that no one person has all the answers. And even if they do, this is something that I learned, is they do not have infinite time to assist you. So creating documentation needs a team, from beginner writers such as myself fumbling their way through your repository to experienced maintainers who can encourage those beginner writers and review and merge their PRs. And JupyterHub's documentation is hosted on GitHub, and this means that contributing to that documentation has to follow a similar workflow as any other code-based contribution. And this process is beneficial in a lot of ways. For instance, I could not simply delete or modify a document without opening a pull request. And that version of that document could then be compared against an earlier version to see whether my changes are meaningful. But this process also means that a writer has to learn a host of other tooling. For example, I remember the team had to organize a meeting to demonstrate how ready rough links work and how to generate them, as some of my pull requests were breaking tests written elsewhere. In this, and my question to you is this overhead necessary? I'll leave that to you. Overall, the experience left me with a newfound appreciation for the Diátaxis framework, which, according to my observations, significantly improved the structure and organization of JupyterHub's documentation. And it is now easy to find tutorials if what you need are lessons about a particular topic, or how-to guides if you are at work and need a quick guide on how to achieve a particular task. So please do check out the JupyterHub docs and leave us some feedback. We'll deeply appreciate that. And thank you so much. Thank you for staying with me. Thank you for being in this session. And I'll now hand over back to Dr. Sarah, and enjoy the rest of the session and enjoy the rest of JupyterCon. Thank you so much.
So, as we said, the speaker is remote, but the second author is here in person and is willing and able to answer any questions.
Yeah, I'll do my best.
Thank you. I really appreciate the talk, something that I'm actually learning actively right now. On the last slide, it was said that, the documentation is much better now. How do you know that?
So I think we don't know that fully, but I think one thing that we do know is that it's an improvement for maintainers. I think maintainers, when writing documentation, feel a lot of decision fatigue. Where do I put this? Before they can even start writing. Whereas if you have the four quadrants that Allan showed are literally 4 folders in the docs folder. And so this, now we can start asking questions like, okay, am I leading someone to a specific answer? Am I explaining something? Is this just technical reference? And that removes some decision fatigue and allows the experienced maintainers to just get on with what they need to do, given that they are time constrained. I feel we need to do some work on some defining good metrics and collecting some information to say whether or not it actually helps new contributors.
I was wondering if we can use the read the doc template if we're developing a widget, for example, like it's linked to Jupyter.
I don't actually understand the question. No, I didn't know there was a read the docs template or a widget.
Sorry? I don't understand what you just said, sorry.
I didn't know there was a read the docs template or a widget. You asked me about a widget?
Yeah,
What
so
widget?
I'm developing a widget, and I'm
Okay.
wondering if I can use that template for making the documentation so that I fit in the framework also, and how free is that? Is there something on the logos, on the colors? Is there a license that I can know?
Yes, you can
about?
use that It's not something JupyterHub developed. It actually came out of the Django project. So it's an open template, and I don't think it's... and I feel like it's more of a... sort of like a mental concept. There isn't a thing that you fork and you put your files here. You can represent that quadrant however you like in your documentation. I think the important thing is to think about your documentation and advertise that is how you're organizing it on the front page. Thank you.
Hi. So on the last slide, he showed one of the points was it's hard for beginner technical writers to start working with docs stored maybe with a project on GitHub. And I had the same experience working with technical writer in my company where I had to basically sit with them and try to teach them GitHub. And that was not even enough. And we try to use CodeSpace, I think, to open the editor to make it a little better, to transfer. Because a lot of new technical writers expect something like CMS of Wiki Editor. Have you found any good workflows for that?
So not in this project. Another open source project I'm a member of is the Turing Way, which is a handbook to collaborative, ethical, reproducible data science, which is, the product is a book, it's not a software piece. And so we come across these frictions a lot. And I think one of the goals of the Turing Way, in a very like subversive way, is to actually get everyone onto version control. So we take the time to run workshops and sit down and actually teach Git. But other ways I've done it is, so for example, HackMD as a markdown collaborative document style can actually hook into a GitHub repository, and you can pull and push branches and sync changes that way. So that might be like a softer onboarding for documentation writers as well.
Thank you. Hey, great talk. My question is, do you have, or did you come up with a process on how to maintain this documentation once you've updated it?
No, and I think it's probably the same process we were running before, which is if you're adding a new feature, then we're not going to merge it until there's docs, probably. I think this is less about maintainability in... I think as a concept, it becomes more easy to maintain because it encourages you to think about documentation in a certain way, as opposed to like a process-based way of approaching maintainability. It's more of a mindset way, if that makes sense. Yeah. There's a couple of questions up here, James.
Thank you so much for the talk, and it sounds like a really good framework. Do you know where we can know more about it?
Yeah, so diátaxis.fr.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My question is kind of related to updating documentation. Adding new features seems to work fine because you can just ask the person who made the new feature to ask to add the new documentation. My main issue is about deprecation on things that have changed, so documentation can get outdated quite quickly. Have you thought of a way to manage deprecation on things that have changed and to iterate over documentation and making sure that it's up to date?
So I believe a lot of the JupyterHub sub-projects use automatically generated changelogs that we release with our notes. And I know whenever we're pushing for a new release, a lot work goes into collecting specific issues that we either want in this release or not in this release. And actually the work that Allan was doing, we wanted to hit a certain completion like percentage before we release JupyterHub version 4 as well. So I think that, again, like, I'm not sure that we have, maybe we have an implicit process, and wearing my JupyterHub community strategic lead hat, then I'm like making a note that maybe we need to write that process down, and like, how do we gather and check this documentation to make sure that it's still relevant and still up to date and still works, but also everybody is welcome to open bug issues and documentation updates, and we appreciate that very much.
Well, thanks again, Sarah, and to Allan virtually.